ocean highways of a globe in arms go the battle fleets which form the front-line strength of the free nations, writing in their wakes of foam the grim historic principle of sea power. He whose guns command the seven seas commands 3/4 of the earth. Focal point of sea power strategy in World War II is the fortress of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean Sea beyond, where at the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean, the Middle Sea, which links the battle zones of the Atlantic with the war fronts of the Far East, lies one of the world's most vital waterways, the Suez Canal. Today, the Suez Canal is a primary objective of the Axis powers, for with this 100-mile stretch of water in their hands, the Germans could dispatch from the ports of Italy ships bearing reinforcements for the armies of Japan, fighting their way westward along the shores of the Indian Ocean. For months past, Allied reconnaissance planes, keeping their ceaseless watch along the approaches to the canal, have reported the presence of ever-increasing hostile forces massing on the coasts of the Mediterranean. And military observers predict that the sun-baked shores of the inland sea will soon become the scene of one of the great decisive battles of history, the battle for the Middle East. And close students of Nazi strategy say that this new menace springs neither from Hitler's so-called intuition nor from the advice of his field commanders. They say it is the first stage in a vast plan of conquest drawn up 1,000 miles from the front line by one of the strangest and most significant figures of our time. Far away in the ancient German city of Munich stands a little noticed building, an institute attached to the university, headed by an unassuming 73-year-old professor of geography, Dr. Karl Haushofer, president of the German Academy, Major General of the Reichswehr, and master planner of Nazi world conquest. By no means the quiet academic retreat it appears, Haushofer's Munich Institute is the nerve center of a highly organized world system of espionage. Typical of its spies sent into every country are the German agents even now being rounded up and brought to justice in the courts of the Western Hemisphere. And from the patient work of some 9,000 operatives such as these, Karl Haushofer has collected in his maps and files what is believed to be the most penetrative mass of knowledge, geographical, political, and strategic, ever assembled about the peoples and lands of the earth. And on this information, he has based a so-called new science, the science of geopolitics, or the military control of space. This is the world of Haushofer and his geopolitical experts. A world of two continents, Eurasia with Africa and the Americas. And both of these gigantic continents, says Haushofer, will be conquered for Germany not by fleets and sea power, but by armies operating on land. As early as April 30th, 1938, came the first indication that this extraordinary boast was far more than a mad professor's dream. For on that day, there thundered past the Nazi warlord a war machine in which the German Navy was hardly represented. A war machine based solely on formidable land power, closely integrated with massive air support. And when this land power juggernaut burst across the frontiers of the Reich, the actual strategy by which Karl Haushofer proposed to achieve his designs became clear for all to see. The Panzer divisions, followed by their supply trains, raced for the seacoasts. They seized the ports and the dockyards of Norway, of the lowlands, of France. All along the shores, they concentrated heavy garrisons and batteries of long-range artillery. They conquered territory for Germany, but much more important, they paralyzed the Allied sea power operating from naval bases on the western coasts of Europe. Today, the geopoliticians of Munich are preparing to embark on the next and most fantastic step in their plan for world conquest, a step which calls for two gigantic drives, southeast and southwest, across the Mediterranean into the heart of Asia and Africa. And by these drives, they hope to extend the German military control of the coasts around the entire shores of the Old World. For within the boundless territory they would thus enclose, they see the greatest empire for the Third Reich that history has ever known. They see within its borders the industrial might of Soviet Russia, producing steel enough to build 3,000 German tanks a day. They see the rich oil fields of the Middle East, so desperately needed by a fatherland already short of fuel. They see in the black muscle of Africa's millions the greatest slave pool in the world for the building of the Nazi New Order. And also within this vast domain, they see the most coveted prize of all, the shining star of India, fifth nation of the globe in wealth. Such is the empire planned for Hitler by the Munich Institute of Geopolitics, an empire of 3 continents and 7/8 of all mankind. Trodden by the feet of conquerors since time began, the shores of the Middle Sea are today witnessing a battle to the death between established Allied sea power and the forces of the Axis attacking from land and sky. Long will Britain's Royal Navy remember the day when from their bases in southern Italy, the Heinkels and the Stukas swooped out of the blinding sun to make their first assault on the seaborne traffic of war. Hard-pressed gunners learned that the Luftwaffe was prepared to sacrifice squadron after squadron in an all-out attempt to sweep every trace of Allied sea power from Mediterranean waters. Next objective beneath the German bomb sites was Malta, the island fortress straddling the route from Italy to northern Africa, whose garrison has since June 1940 endured undaunted twice as many air raids as the citizens of London. And scarcely had the smoke lifted from the first attacks on Malta, and the armies of General Wavell were rushing westward into Libya to meet the Axis columns driving across the sands of Africa for Egypt and the Suez. While the thrust and counter-thrust of desert war still swayed back and forth along the Mediterranean southern shores, German air and land power struck again. Blasting from the sky what scanty air resistance the Allies could muster, the Luftwaffe swept across the calm Aegean to launch its mass attacks upon the island of Crete. Airborne divisions of the Wehrmacht, firmly entrenched along the barren Cretan coasts, were gazing southward toward the Suez, a short 200 miles away across the sea. And today, from the Balkan states, come reports of preparations for a yet greater southward drive. All winter long, say these reports, invasion barges have been massing down the Danube. All winter long, German storm divisions, in numbers far larger than could be needed for policing purposes, have been swarming through Bulgaria and Yugoslavia, heading southward for the ports of Greece. And most significant of all is the Nazi limelight on Turkey, the bridge for invading armies marching from Europe into Asia. Ominous to the diplomatic corps at Ankara is the presence of Franz von Papen, for all experience shows that where this bland appeaser leads, the Wehrmacht follows. And calculating the strength of his own army against the mighty war machine represented by von Papen, Turkey's President Inonu is grimly aware that the German spearheads are already pointing towards the Middle East. This is the probable plan of campaign. Looking southeast across the Mediterranean, the German strategists have their eyes upon the Suez Canal and upon the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Middle East. Capture these, and Russia is impotent, Britain's sea power broken. The initial move, therefore, is a double pincer advance. The first, directed at the Suez, jumping off from the deserts of North Africa and sweeping southward from Greece through the Holy Land. The second, through the Crimea and across the Black Sea to the Caucasus. That done, the Drang nach Osten begins in earnest, a converging drive eastward, engulfing the oil fields of Iraq and Iran, and moving on across the northwest frontier to India beyond. Ranged along the eastern shores of the Mediterranean to meet the drive when it comes are such Allied forces as can be spared from the fronts already in action in Libya and the Crimea. But with German bombers swarming in Mediterranean skies, all the supplies and reinforcements needed from Britain and the New World must take the long, slow route around the Cape of Good Hope to the ports of Arabia and Iran. Up the glittering waters of the Red Sea today are going the freighters and the troopers, laden to the gunwales with the sinews for the battle to come. And at heavily guarded ports with names almost unknown to Western ears, Aqaba and Aden, Bushir and Basra and Banda Shapur, sweating U.S. service troops are unloading war equipment with all the speed the limited dock facilities can afford. And up from the wharf sides, over the rough and jolting cracks of roller coaster railroads, winding through the blistering valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates, men and munitions move northward, northward to the battlefront. And northward, too, through lands and cities reverently familiar to all the peoples of the Western world, goes the mobile firepower needed to stem the rolling tide of German armored divisions. Northward through the cobbled streets of Nazareth, along the twisting banks of Jordan and the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Up through Damascus, the city stormed by David, where Paul conversed with God. Out onto the tawny plains of Syria, past the road crews toiling with backs against the hot desert winds, and the signalers laying lines of communication across a world of choking dust. Northward to where the war-scarred glories of past kingdoms gaze down on yet another battle line. And here on the northern shores of Syria, where fought Xerxes and Caesar, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, the armies of the United Nations take their stand amid the ruins of Mediterranean empires long forgotten. And through the sights of 50,000 guns, look out across the blue of sea and sky toward the shores of Europe and the massing hosts who seek to build in blood and iron the first world empire of all history. 2,000 miles westward of the Allied lines in Syria stands the Rock of Gibraltar, guardian since the 18th century of the gateway to the inland sea. Today, with its garrison heavily reinforced, with Canadian hard rock miners strengthening its already formidable bastions, Gibraltar looks out with increasing watchfulness to the shores of Africa, only 8 miles away across the strait. Here stand the provinces of Morocco and Algeria, cornerstones of the Empire of France. Serving a Vichy government, obliged to collaborate ever more closely with Nazi designs, the powerful French North African forces well know that their desert strongholds lie directly on a trail of conquest marked out all down the western shores of Africa by the geopolitical brain trust of Munich. First sign of German interest in this western route to empire appeared in war-torn Spain when they marched down the Prado of Madrid, past the victorious Caudillo, the endless ranks of Nazis who had fought in the Civil War. And only then did the democracies awake to the fact that Spain was an ideal stepping stone from Germany to Africa. Today, that first Nazi penetration of southwestern Europe bears ominous fruit as the rulers of Phalangist Spain and Vichy France meet under German coercion, forced to comply with the demand for a rite of passage from Berlin to the Atlantic coasts of Africa. This is the route they must open now to Hitler's agents, later perhaps to the Wehrmacht. A route that leads southwest across the Mediterranean to one of the most significant places of World War II, Dakar. Situated on the extremity of the African bulge, the French city of Dakar is the nearest point in the old world to the Americas. Only 5 hours fast flying time to Brazil. Most powerful unit of the considerable military and naval forces centered on Dakar is the giant Vichy battleship Richelieu, whose once free crew must now serve a single ideal: discipline. Today, the North African cities, which lie on the route to Dakar, Oran, Tunis, and Algiers, are virtually occupied by the foreign division of the Gestapo, known to work in close association with Karl Haushofer. And in Morocco's capital, Casablanca, Sultan Sidi Mohammed, friend of Free France, has already been escorted from his palace and replaced by a German official, a Gauleiter in all but name. From a dozen airfields along the Mediterranean coasts of Africa, Nazi manned survey planes are heading south, mapping out the route for a new $10 million railroad, which will cut downwards across the wastes of the Sahara towards Dakar. Already the building materials for this strategic trans-Saharan line are moving up country. Far in the interior, the slave labor of defeated French armies is blasting its way southward through the desert rocks with a single injunction from its German masters: complete this railroad within 1 year. And from Dakar itself, where the warm tropical Atlantic laps the moles of West Africa's finest harbor, come reports, apparently confirmed by these recent authentic pictures, of a strange new interest displayed by unidentified visitors in the coast defenses, defenses now being manned at full war strength. Night after night, say these reports, the big Vichy submarine, Jules Verne, is heading out to sea on mysterious missions, her bunkers filled to capacity with fuel oil. And as the U-boats operating in the South Atlantic intensify their campaign to close the ocean to Allied shipping, the Western Hemisphere remembers the ominous warning of Cordell Hull. Were Britain to lose command of the seas, Germany could easily cross the Atlantic, especially the South Atlantic. So before our eyes, we see the first steps being taken to clear the way for the only seaborne drive necessary to the fulfillment of Karl Haushofer's fantastic dream: the assault of Nazi Germany upon the New World and upon that other waterway so vital to United Nations sea power. And as the peoples of the Western world mass their gigantic war power to crush this wildest of imperial dreams, they base their strategy not only on their formidable sea power and on their countless bomber squadrons cruising the Atlantic from Halifax to Rio. they send 5,000 miles across the sea the power of land attack needed to destroy the plan at its source. And as they watch the deep-laden convoys disappearing below the eastern horizon, they realize that the first lines of hemisphere defense lie no more along their own coasts, but in the sand-swept tracks of tanks, moving forward to battle lines drawn up along the sun-scorched shores of the far-off Mediterranean. In the gleaming wings of fighters keeping their unceasing vigil above the very cradle of mankind, where the proud ramparts, raised by conquerors of the past, write their lesson for the would-be conquerors of today, their stern lesson of empires born of vanity and greed, and swiftly brought to dust.